Good morning, everyone who's in Ottawa and surrounding areas in Eastern Standard Time. Good afternoon, London, England, and our friends and colleagues who are listening to this in Europe. Good evening in Yangon and other countries. Welcome. My name is Edgar Rodriguez. I am the leading senior officer on Myanmar programming at the International Development Research Center, IDRC, here in Ottawa, Canada. And it's great pleasure that I welcome to all the participants. We have more than 100 registered attendees for this event today, coming from many parts of the world. Starting from Canada and the US. We have a number of civil society organizations, think tanks, universities. We have the bulk of our participants are from Myanmar, and they come from a wide spectrum of organizations. I am glad to see representatives from Yangon University of Economics, University of Mandalay, but also from the Cooperative College, in Fungi. We have from Patain University, we have from Metila University, we have from the Yangon University of Foreign Languages, we have from the National Management Degree College, and many other organizations. So welcome. I really welcome them very warmly to this session. We also have participants from other parts of Asia, in our friends from Chiang Mai University in Thailand and many other places. We have representatives, as I mentioned, from Europe, several universities, the British Council, the Global Development Network, University College London, of course, and I will be trying to highlight some of the institutional participants as we go through the question period. So welcome you all to this important session, and Happy New Year. And welcome again to the first edition of the Myanmar Speaker Series 2021. This series aims at taking deep dives by experts and practitioners working on a wide range of policy issues concerning Myanmar. The series is part of the Knowledge for Democracy initiative, which has promoted capacity building for policy research in Myanmar since 2017. We work with hundreds of individuals in more than 30 counterparts, in universities, state parliaments, think tanks, civil society organizations in Myanmar and abroad. The initiative is jointly funded by IDRC and Global Affairs Canada. In the fall of 2020, this initiative had a mini-series of about 10 webinars around talking about the 2020 elections. The webinars attracted more than 700 people. These webinars represented updates on current research funded by the initiative and shed light on Myanmar's fascinating political and social transformation as the country was heading into the elections last Sunday, November 8th. The webinars gave an update on the August 2020 peace process and how the process continues to embody the best hope that Myanmar has to overcome decades-long ethnic grievances. We also heard during these webinars the need to nurture the newly elected subnational parliaments in Myanmar, which represents the country's 14 states and regions, where ethnic parties play a key role to raise the voice of greater representation and decentralization. In these webinars, we also heard about the results of surveys from ethnic states to gauge the need for change in key public services, such as policing, health, but also education. The results of those surveys presented in the webinars underscore the improvements in the perceptions about these services under the National League for Democracy administration, but it also highlighted the great expectations that Myanmar has regarding decentralization or further decentralization. 3 of the webinars focus on gender equality in politics with local and international scholars. These webinars also brought survey results that were based on interviews with members of parliament, political parties, surveys of the population at large regarding political participation which underscore the importance of family backgrounds, education, networks, funding, and cultural norms. All of these factors were actually influencing the participation of women in politics in Myanmar. So in last December, we had our last webinar, which focused on a special edition of the Doing Research Assessment. This is a webinar led by the Global Development Network and Myanmar Center for Economic and Social Development. Here we explore the state of social science research in Myanmar, a research effort that is taking place in universities and think tanks. I would like to thank the National Education Policy Commission, led by Professor Dr. Moe and his colleagues within the university system, who attended and provided insightful comments to this report. Today, the Myanmar Speaker Series turns to examine more in depth the education field. Education remains an undisputed cornerstone of any democracy. And education remains an important component of the recent Myanmar's history. After independence from the British rule, the education system in Myanmar was a model of excellence in Southeast Asia. Many believe the country was heading the way of other Asian tigers at that time, and it did not. The protracted armed conflicts in the ethnic states resulted in displacement and huge disruptions in education services in the region. During the 60s, the education sector was turned completely upside down. Not only was education severely underfunded in Myanmar, but also teaching became a job that lacked the satisfaction and prestige from before. Given the years of isolation and academic suppression, pedagogy in the public education system, including those in higher education, still relies heavily on memorization and neglects critical thinking, which remains so central to any capacity for conducting research. Ensuring that millions of young Myanmar students receive a quality education that prepares them for the 21st century will require enormous reforms at all levels. The Ministry of Education has already prioritized teacher education, and so has our initiative when working with public universities. The National Education Strategy Plan provided the government, education stakeholders, and citizens with a roadmap for sector-wide reforms during the period that ends this year. And there is a new strategy in the making for the next decade. So today we have our expectations are to look at have a perspective on what is coming up for Myanmar in terms of the transformation. Myanmar is still facing reform in the midst of a pandemic and continued armed conflict, but it's also entering a new democratic period. The talk will address what comes next for Myanmar. It's a reflection on the road ahead in terms of education reform. We are very fortunate to count with two very experienced and knowledgeable presenters to tell us more about the educational sector in Myanmar. We'll start first with Professor Lal. Professor Lal is a professor of education and South Asian studies at the University College London, UCL, Institute of Education. She specializes in political issues and education with a focus on gender, ethnicity, and social exclusion, and the linkage between national identity, citizenship, and education. Professor Lal completed her bachelor's in economics and PhD from London School of Economics and Political Sciences, and her MPhil from Cambridge University. Her recent book, Myanmar's Education Reforms, A Pathway to Social Justice, reviews the state of education in Myanmar over the past decade. We're all very eager to listen to you, Professor Lau. So please, the floor is yours. Thank you again for leading the talk.
Thank you so much, Edgar, for having me, and thank you for allowing me to speak a bit about my latest book on Myanmar. This book is based on about a decade's worth of data. I've been very fortunate that I've been able to be part of this process. Those who know me know that I've been coming to Myanmar for almost 20 years and obviously have a particular interest in issues of education. The book is open access, which means that anyone can download it for free, but you can also buy a copy if that's what's preferred for libraries and so on and so forth. What I'd like to do today is to just very briefly take you back to the starting point 10 years ago in 2010, looking at the overall education problems in Myanmar, which we need to remind ourselves how far we have come. So 2010, there was largely a lack of schools, especially in remote areas. Dropout rates, almost 25% of post-grade 5 students dropped out. Things have improved slightly, and I'll talk about that in just a minute. The financial contributions by the parents to the government education system were almost 70%. I was part of a UNICEF team that calculated this, and this is simply parents helping schools with repairs, contributing to the salary payments of teachers and sometimes supplementing those. This is not part of the tuitions. This is on the side of tuitions. Pedagogical problems of rote learning with chapter end tests and lots of exams. So state control and very sort of tight centralization and decades of underinvestment. That's the starting point. And at the point when we had the 2010 elections, there was obviously international pressure to start reforming the entire country, and education was a key part of this. So this is the journey that the book covers, those 10 years, to show what has been achieved, and a lot has been achieved. And although I look at this with a critical eye, I want to say right from the start that I'm very, very proud to see what the ministry has done. Now, let me take you to 2015. Between 2010 and 2015, the first big sort of review which was conducted was the Comprehensive Education Sector Review, CESR. That was probably one of the smartest things, I believe, that the MOE did, although many at the time were very ambivalent about it and very not very convinced. I think giving MOE staff a better understanding of what the problems were on the ground by allowing them to actually travel to schools and look into the sector was incredibly valuable and resulted actually with the nest that we have today. But the book also covers the Education Promotion Implementation Committee and how the national law was formed, the Parliamentary Education Promotion Committee, so the formal side of things, and the contestations from civil society through what the National Network of Education Reform was doing. So civil society actually also went on the streets and protested, and it covers what the aid agencies contributed, particularly the World Bank and the drive for decentralization through the school grants and stipends program. Now, let's remember, please, that although everyone agreed that education needed to be reformed, people really didn't agree. And this was brought to a head with the new education law and the student protests. I was in the country when this was going on, when people were on the streets and protesting. But despite all of these debates, we ended up with a document which has spearheaded one of the most comprehensive education reforms in the world, and that is the National Education Sector Strategic Plan. And actually, the interesting thing for me was that when the NLD came into power in 2015, they did not throw out what had been done before. And it was very good that there was this continuity from the National Education Sector Plan to the National Education Strategic Plan, which has underpinned the reforms. The aim of equity, quality, and relevance go right through this document. And in order to achieve this, we had 9 transformational shifts. And I'm not going to take you through those. The book deals in detail with what's happened in many of those, not all. I mean, the book deals with basic education and the curriculum, with teacher education, higher education, and some parts of alternative education. But really, I was being privileged that I've been able to be part of this reform journey, because as part of all of this, there were training programs which were offered by UCL to the Ministry of Education to support them in some of these changes. And that's how I've been able to sort of see from the inside, not only from the schools level, but also from the ministerial level, as to how these changes were taken forward. So I'm going to speak about 3 parts. One, reforms to basic education, then higher education, and then what's happened in some ethnic education areas. It won't be in detail. Please do download the book and have a look. The reforms to basic education are comprehensive and very complex. The main thing being to moving to a 12-year schooling and a formalized KG year. That means moving from 11 years to 13. And that means massive changes with regard to the curriculum delivery, but also curriculum was entirely rehauled and rewritten. The basic curriculum was rehauled by JICA. They've done a really good job. The responses from parents to this new curriculum have been very positive. But this also meant that if you have a new curriculum and you have 12 years to deliver what you used to deliver in 11 years, assessment and examinations have to drastically change, and teacher training has to have a rehaul of its curriculum as well. Teacher training is now going to be a 4-year degree as opposed to a 2-year certificate that it was before. And this basic change means that teachers are hopefully going to have their status upgraded again. I remember, Edgar, you just said that there was a degrading of the teacher status. The MOE now also has a monitoring and evaluation unit, which means that they actually do their research and look at how the changes are happening in the field. And there's an increased support for monastic education. And all of this is done with the ministry sort of getting support. But there are obviously issues that are part of all of this, and how far not everything has been successful. Anyway, this is a brief picture of one of the UCL trainings we did at the ministry. I think this must have been 2018 or 2019. Now, higher education, very close to my heart because I'm a professor at UCL. I was part of the first training of the NIHED trainers, the National Institute for Higher Education and Development, which is an incredibly important institution in that it's going to allow the support to all the Myanmar universities to start becoming autonomous. And autonomy has been one of those big things which universities have been asking for. And I think it's one of the most important move forward in Myanmar higher education, because it means that academics will be able to run their own research agenda. That automatically means that the curriculum is going to change. I mean, generally what autonomous universities do is we teach what we research, and that's what brings the field forward. So quality are directly related to independent research agendas. But that also means big changes as dealing with ethics committees and making sure that students are engaged, and how to manage international engagement with your partners, international partners, with regards to research projects and publications. And all of these things are new to many of my academic colleagues in Myanmar. And they've only been doing this for the last 2-3 years, and it's a steep learning curve. But all of this is done with the support of the government, and government funding is really important. And I want to emphasize this. The government funding has to continue to support these universities as they go forward. And one of the trainings we did, for example, is here. That was with the top management of universities from across the country, and that was on our last day. The book gives a lot of details of the kind of trainings we did and what these universities have been achieving. The last bit I just want to cover very briefly before handing back is engaging with ethnic education. As many of you will know, Myanmar doesn't only have government education, and it doesn't only have private education. The book doesn't deal with private education because I looked at the reforms, and the reforms really didn't touch private education. They only touched government education. But they did also touch ethnic education, because the schools that are run by ethnic armed groups and by ethnic communities, and that largely use mother tongue-based multilingual education, have been asking for recognition and equivalence for a long time. And in order to build a collaboration between the different sectors, there needs to be some trust building. I was fortunate to be part of the World Bank's Myanmar Education Partnership Project, where the team engaged with both sides, specifically also with willing ethnic armed group education departments, to discuss what needed to be done in order for children to be able to be have their schooling recognized, and to allow children to get equal access to education and a pathway to higher education, because the non-recognized schools mean that children are not able to enter Myanmar higher education. So that was one of our meetings in Naypyidaw with the Karen Education Department, presenting what they are doing to the Ministry of Education. Now, where are we after a decade? The heartening thing for me, the book is based around the question of social justice. That's part of the title. The heartening thing for me is that the problems that Myanmar has are really well understood. If you read the policy texts, if you speak to the ministry, they understand the problems. The issue is that many of the reform programs do actually not deliver on the policy priorities. It's what we call a policy practice gap. Partly this is because lessons from previous reform programs run by UNICEF and JICA have not been learned. Partly it's also for other reasons, structural, like hierarchies, but also trying to make, you look at the 9 transformational shifts, all change at once is very, very difficult. And I'm hoping that the opportunity of writing NESP 2, sort of the second National Education Strategic Plan, will allow for a little more discernment, a little more coordination, and an understanding of what works and why. But let me just say, Myanmar education has come a massively long way. And with that, I hand back to the floor.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Lau. That was a very concise overview of the reform process in Myanmar. Now we have Dr. Show Moe, who's going to talk to us about the educational sector in Myanmar. He's the president of Autonomy University. He founded Autonomy Institute in 2017 after his return from the US, where he conducted his doctoral research at Yale University. He has taught courses in scientific inquiry at the Autonomy Institute's leadership program, and is a key player in the new Autonomy Center for Education Policy Research, SERV. And we're going to hear about the center today a little bit more. The center has now launched a new journal of education. Show Moe envisions an education system that will break down to all the barriers of knowledge and learning in Myanmar. We're also very pleased to have him as a speaker today, since he joined our Knowledge for Democracy Myanmar Initiative's National Advisory Committee in 2018, and we've enjoyed having him on board. So we're very eager to listen from you, Show. So the floor is yours.
Thank you. For this presentation, so I'm going to speak in Burmese because many of the audience are Burmese, so that's why I would speak to make it more useful. That's why I would speak in Burmese. So people who only understand English, I think you can access to the translation button at the bottom. Please select the English for the translation. Thank you. For the Autonomy University Institute, so we have established in 2017 at the early stage of early years of 2017. We are the private and non-profit, the higher education institute. So many people confuse when we said that we are non-profit and private. That they brought that we will train everyone for free cost, but we have to explain them several times that to make them clear. And we also have to develop the policy briefing paper to explain those audience who confused about non-profit. So our Professor Lau has already mentioned about some part of quite comprehensively and touching the reform process, quite generic and quite overviewed. So, but I don't have experience like Professor Lau, but I've been running this center at the end of 2017. That's why regarding with this center. So I'm going to briefly about how I grown up and when we changed the educational policy reform, how this center are contributing for the reform process of the country. And I'll touch on that part. Firstly, our objective is very clear. So in the higher education policies, it need to be practical and based on evidence. policy, evidence-based policy, higher education policy, to develop the evidence-based higher education policies. With that objective, we run this center. And the other thing is that in Myanmar, not only the policy of domestic policy, but also the international, the higher educational policy and best practice and standards and best practice, to inform about those practice to our fellow Myanmar people about those international standards about the higher educational policies. Our Professor Lau has already touching some points regarding with this issue on there are some progress in the higher education reform process. How we're going to measure those progress? So how we are going to achieve the progressive reform which are measurable? So we have 3 objectives with a goal. The goal of this center is to become an independent hub of knowledge, expertise, like a think tank, and resource and educational policy development, especially in higher education. With that goal, we established this center. So at the early stage of our center, so we were able to run the center at the end of 2019. But before 2019, we have been conducted series of workshops. So with the objective, as Professor Lau has mentioned, regarding with the NESP, in that strategic plans, the government has clearly stated what they want to do with the educational reform, and clearly stated and stretch out their plans about the educational reform with a good intention and objectives. So that's why we conduct series of workshops and to be able to help support and contribute those reform materialize and to be materialized. In those series of workshops, many participants from the parliamentarians are also attended, and the rectors and professors and of different many universities were also there in those different workshops. In 2019, regarding with July, regarding with that, we conduct one workshop on accreditation. What we mainly understand, and we specialize on the area regarding with accreditations, is that how US has been conducting this accreditation. That's why we invited one of the well-experienced professors to inform the rectors and to the policymaker. We conduct that workshop with that objective in 2018 December, that regarding with the national, the educational plans, and to allow the university independence, and they are aiming to give autonomy of the university. When we run about the autonomous university, what should we do and what we should not do? So to help support them, we conduct that workshop to help support them through. We invited Fulbright scholar to explain them about what is do and don't, to inform them about do and don't in running the autonomous university. In early 2019, in the autonomous university, so like a universal council are very crucial. Their role is very crucial. How we are going to establish those universal council, their role is very crucial and very important. And how that council will help university raise the funding. So in that workshop, we did discuss wide ranks of issue on this regarding with this issue in 2019 regarding with accreditation, not only within the accreditation within the university, but also the outside external actor when they came to inspect for the accreditations and what will they look, and then we organize workshop to discuss about those issues. In October 2019, again, like an NESP is already well functioned already now. So the change and reforms of the NESP, how to develop the strategic plan for 6 whole weeks. We invited the experts for 6 weeks to provide them. with the rectors and all the professors, and including the administrators of different universities were there in that workshop. So since until 2019, we just only running our center like a workshop-based center. Later, we came to realize that the running workshop-based activity is not enough. So we need to establish a centers and to conduct evidence-based research to help them contribute. That's why at the end of 2019, we established this center. In this center, and right now, we publish newsletters from our centers with a brief information, and we conducted interviews, and we cover those interviews in our newsletters. And we also published and released policy briefings and policy briefs to the higher all the rectors, and we interview them to those university rectors, and what are their requirements, what do they need, what kinds of knowledge they need to be equipped with their guidance. We publish these policy briefs. When we talk about, Morilao has already mentioned about rector committees also there. We keep in touch with those rector committees, and we always inquire and follow up to them. What can we help and what do we do? And then based on our discussion, we release this policy brief. And regarding the references, right now, so glossaries of the higher education. We have been published the glossaries, and then you can find the detail in those newsletter about the speech of the rectors and Dr. Moe, the NASB head of and then the views and point of views of the students and teachers. We compile their perceptions and views into those newsletters regarding what our policy briefs, and to have how we should do the curriculum autonomy. In that policy brief, we touch about how to develop the autonomous curriculum. And in Myanmar, one of the difficulties, financial autonomy is quite difficult in Myanmar because many of the Myanmar public universities either in the rector or students, when they got a donation with a surplus, and at the end of the fiscal year, the university have to return all those donations left over to the Ministry of Education. That's why the university never have enough saving. For example, when they want to build infrastructure or one building, or when they want to run one initiative and program, they have to reapply. They are not allowed to reinvest those surplus donation left over from the unused resources, which they have to return to the Ministry of Education. That's why we give a policy brief. We publish policy brief how we can overcome these kinds of challenges. In order to overcome those challenges, in Myanmar, the existing university foundation should be established as a legal entity. So those university foundation should raise a funding rather than returning the leftover fund to the Ministry of Education, whether purchasing estates or lands or running a research center or building a construction of the research center, rather than returning those funds to the Ministry of Education. That's why we give an information about that they can establish a university foundation to run funds regarding with the physical autonomy. So regarding with there are many profit-oriented university, private university are running. So in Myanmar, is where people are quite not familiar with how they can run the non-profit private university. That's why we issue this policy brief to inform people about how we can run about the non-profit public private the university. Then the university council is very important for the university autonomy and independence. In those council, rectors, and all the administrators of different university to be able to function their responsibility and function well and effective. And we inform them what are the best practice internationally from the European practice, the US practice, and Hong Kong practice. We analyze all those different practice and we give a recommendation to them. And as a reference, as I said, regarding with the higher education, we issue the glossary for the higher education, and we upload it online, so you can find So the Parmi Education Center for Research, and you can access on the online. You can find both in English and Myanmar. So what does accreditation mean? Rather than using two or three different definitions, and then we're providing this glossary for free to inform people to develop their knowledge. So Edgar has already mentioned as well, the Journal of Education in Parami is quite new initiative. In the last year, October 2020, we start this journal, quite recent. It just only focus on education. Just only focus on the education. This journal is this journal is a peer review journal. So for the research articles, we have a board of editors. They review the blinds way for the general articles. For example, the perceptions and the recommendations, or the comments and commentaries, or sharing life stories, we cover as a general articles. In the general articles, so for the personal stories, you can submit your personal stories or your case studies and your perceptions on the education or educational perspectives. So you can send different area, and you can also submit war education in focus. And you can also write an article about the Myanmar education in focus, or either in gender and ethnicity or disability rural education. On this 4 area, you can also cover any articles on this 4 area. This is about the general articles. For the research articles, for the original research papers, you can also cover the policy analysis, or you can also review articles. And for many research articles, is go through the double blind. For the general articles, for the Center for Education Policy Research, the Parmi Journal of Education, the editorial board make a decision. The next rounds of journal will be February 28th of 2021. So you have to submit before the February. So you can Google us, and you can also commission through online, through submission. You can submit through online. In our editorial team, we have a well-experienced international experts, and rectors and professors are also part of. Mary Law is also our editorial advisor, one of the editorial advisors of our center. So allow me to conclude my presentation here.
Thank you very much.